Hey there, YouTube. Mr. Vimes here, and I'm looking to introduce you to a couple of brews that we've got here over at Mr. Vimes MTG, featuring one of my favorite cards from Throne of Eldraine, Charming Prince. This guy is pretty unassuming. He's just a 2/2 for 2, standard bear, but the flexibility that he allows for your individual decks seems absolutely fantastic. Uh, I was shocked when I was watching LSV and Matt Nass's top 5 video that he didn't make it into the top 5 cards to Impact Standard. And I wanted to showcase some of the different options and some of the flexibility that he allows in strategies in your decks moving forward. And so today I want to introduce you to 4 different brews. I have a Bant brew that's revolves around Cavalier of Thorns and Agent of Treachery. That's this deck right here. There's also an Orzhov brew looking to capitalize on the life gain mode. And then I have a Selesnya brew and an Azorius brew, both of which are trying to capitalize on the flicker mode. So before I move in, we've got talk about the 3 modes. When Charming Prince enters the battlefield, you can either scry 2, gain 3 life, or exile another target creature you own and return it to the battlefield during your next end step. Now, this is a lot like Momentary Blank, Flicker Wisp style effects, things like that. And we know historically those are very strong effects. Getting access to that effect for 2 mana, even though it's not at instant speed, seems like it opens up a lot of deck building options. One of those, in my opinion, is to look to update the contemporary Simic, Cavalier of Thorns, and Agent of Treachery strategy that's been around for the last couple months, along with Risen Reef, and create a kind of ramp plus value deck aiming at recurring a bunch of your permanents and then stealing a bunch of their permanents. And so the core of this strategy is 4 Charming Prince, 4 Teferi Time Reveler, and then the idea is to use Gilded Goose plus Oko to steal cheap permanents. So you can flicker your goose to get a new food token on turn 2, for example, or later in the game, and then you can play Oko and take a cheaper creature. In addition, you can flicker Risen Reef to continue ramping, and then you have Teferi to bounce your own Risen Reef and Gilded Goose and replay them to continue generating more food to feed Oko. Once you get past the early and mid game, which should be reasonably quick because this deck runs 4 Goose, 4 Paradise Druid, and 4 Risen Reef, as well as 4 Once Upon a Time. You can start doing the same thing with Cavalier of Thorns and Agent of Treachery to continue ramping and to start stealing all of your opponent's permanents. This prince is so charming that he shows up and he seduces everyone away from you, is kind of the idea here. So I think that's fairly flavorful. And I also think that it helps us really capitalize on Oko and Prince and Once Upon a Time to get a very powerful 3 mana strategy. One thing to note about this format is that running more than 2 colors outside of a green deck is likely to be very difficult. And so if you can find a way to capitalize on Goose, Paradise Druid, Once Upon a Time, these sort of Utopia mana ramp effects, or mana search effects, you have access to a lot more options. I don't have a sideboard for this deck yet. I think it's got so many different options that it's worth waiting to see how the meta shakes out. But the combination of Oko and Agent is really, really powerful. Couple other things to note here. It's possible that we should be running a 3rd or a 4th Oko. I think 4 might be too many, but 3 is possibly correct. It depends on how reliable the exchange ability is in this format. as it works out. Taking, playing this on turn 2, creating a food token, and then taking their Risen Reef or something similar does seem pretty good. I'm also running Time Wipe as the Wrath. Again, this is a nice way of getting access to our value permanents and just to keep recurring them. This deck sort of exists in the middle of the space where the Simic Yoink deck was and where Bant Golos was post-board. So give it a look, give it a shot. There's a couple other possibilities that you might want to explore. You could try making Golos work in this kind of strategy. I'm not sure if the mana works if you're running Golos. I think the only way it's going to work is if you're also running Circuitous Route, because Guild Gates are the best way of getting 5-color fixing, and so I think that's a completely different deck, but it is worth giving it a shot. It's also possible that we might want to see if we can fit 1 or 2 copies of Field of the Dead, possibly in the Castle Garenbrig slot, or maybe in like a Temple of Mystery slot, or instead of, because I don't think we can afford to cut any basics. If Once Upon a Time can find that reliably enough, again, the mana base requires some tweaking because we need to have a way of having 7 different types of permanents, or types of lands, and so this would be a little bit tricky. One of the more likely options, and this is something that I've built the Azorius deck around, is Dungeon Geists. If you need the ability to pressure, I think this is an excellent card to have in your sideboard. It's also really flexible because you can flicker it and lock down a different creature. You can bounce it and replay it to lock down a different creature. And so it really does offer quite a lot of options if your opponent plays a threat that's worse for you than whatever they had out on turn 4. Okay, so that's our first deck. I think that's one of the more straightforward and obvious strategies for this format. This one's a little bit different. The idea here, this is the Orzhov brew, is not to be completely focused on knights, although you'll see there are a fair number of knights in the deck anyway, just because of the way the set is. But I'm calling this Prince of the Pride because the idea here is to capitalize as much as possible on the life gain mode on Charming Prince instead of the flicker mode. You'll note that the Ajani we have access to now, which I did experiment a little with in Jeskai during the last format, has a -2 ability that makes its own Ajani's Pridemate. And so this deck has access to 8 copies of Ajani's Pridemate, in addition to 4 copies of Bloodthirsty Aerialist. So this is something like a incremental value Soul Sisters style of deck, in between your sort of Black White Rock and Soul Sisters. The idea is to have enough ways of gaining life so that we can recur and continue casting Murderous Rider, which is arguably, if not certainly, the strongest card in Throne of Eldraine. This card has the adventure Swift and 1 black, which is essentially for instant, essentially a hero's downfall, except you lose 2 life. And then when you replay it, it's a 2/3. Now it does get put onto the bottom of the owner's library when it dies, and so you're not going to be able to get it out of your graveyard as effectively as possible. But because of the number of life gain effects we have, we do want a couple of ways of bringing things back, in particular our Pridemates and our Aerialists. So, in addition, other ways of taking advantage of the life loss, Final Payment's one of them. This is a list where you might try something like Rankle, the 3/3 fairy for 4 that has a variety of modes in the current set. One of which is drawing a card, or is both players drawing a card and losing a life. We also have Sorin, and I'm trying out 2 copies of Order of Midnight in the 2-drop slot. I'm not sure about this. It is a 2/2 flyer for 2, and it has Raise Dead essentially as its adventure. Can get you back a Midnight Reaper, can get back a Cavalier of Night, can get back a Pridemate. I'm not certain about the exact slotting of that. It may turn out that this deck wants to be a little bit more aggressive, largely because you can't recur Murderous Rider. In that case, I've set up a maybe board here of Venerable Knights and Black Lance Paragons that skews a little bit more towards the Knight package and opens up the ability to run a couple copies of Tournament Grounds and to possibly play Circle of Loyalty as well. So it can become a sort of black-white combination Pridemate Knight package. In addition, I think a good top end for this style of strategy is something like Bolas's Citadel, Command the Dreadhorde. You can use Final Payment as an excellent 2-mana removal spell. Hits every single creature, and if you're playing, this many life gain effects between Ajani, Sorin, and Charming Prince, you can generally have access to paying the life. Oops, this should not be Castle Embereth. This should be the Black Castle. So for those of you who are a little confused, I just need to update this list real quick. I'll do that before I post the video. But the Black Castle, as well as Witch's Cottage, the Black Castle has the ability to draw a card as long as you have no cards in hand. So it's sort of land versions of Midnight Reaper. You lose life when you draw the card. So we're trying to take advantage of this sort of life gain, life loss interaction. One card that it might be worth testing out if you can find a way to reliably destroy it or return it is the 2-mana Witchclaw Talisman that allows you to tutor. That might be a decent way of tutoring up your Bolas's Citadel or your Command the Dreadhorde in the late game. It might open up the ability to run a package, say, with like an Elder Spell and in addition to the D-Spark, maybe one copy of Legion's End main deck, maybe a copy of Gideon or Cavalier of Dawn, something like that. That is one possible way of destroying it, is to find a way to run Cavalier of Dawn. You can tutor up the Cavalier and then replay it to destroy, and then play it to destroy the Witchclaw Talisman. Might be too cute, might require a little bit too much effort. But there you have our second sort of deck. All right, the last two decks are a little bit less clearly tuned. In particular, this deck. This is a Selesnya idea I'm working on. The idea here is to use Charming Prince's Flicker ability along with Proliferate mechanics and feed in with Ajani the Great-Hearted, Vivian Arcbow Ranger, and then a bunch of sort of good flicker targets at the mid and top end. Knight of Autumn, Tolsimir as a way of clearing out problematic small creatures, God Eternal Ronas to pump your team, Trostani to pump your team and make a bunch of tokens, and protect yourself against the Oko strategies that are almost certain to show up. And then use Pollenbright Druid to pump your team along with Ajani the Great-Hearted and Vivian. I also have Castle Ardenvale to make tokens, and Idyllic Grange to put counters onto pre-existing creatures. The one thing I'm not certain about here is whether Growth Chamber Guardian is right or whether this should be another Pridemate deck. If this is another Pridemate deck that generates its own counters, allows us to take a little more advantage of the life gain on Charming Prince and Ajani. Something along those lines. It also opens up, instead of running the Vivian package, we can run 4-mana white Ajani, Ajani Strength of the Pride in those slots and get access to 7 or 8 life gain effects. The reason I haven't done that here is because I'm just not certain that that strategy would have enough card advantage. I'm also not entirely sure that it's fast enough in the long run, but it might be worth a shot. You'll notice I have Questing Beast here in the sideboard. I think this is probably better in Gruul, and I'm working on another video where we'll explore sort of Bone Crusher Giant in Gruul and in Izzet and a couple of other places, making use of Questing Beast. But I do think Questing Beast is a good sideboard card here, um, as sort of a more catch-all Shifting Ceratops type card. Voracious Hydra in the board as well. You'll notice this deck only runs 22 lands. Again, that's because of Once Upon a Time. Frank Karsten had an excellent article on Channel Fireball a while back, noting that probably the best way to start brewing with Once Upon a Time is to stick 4 of them in your deck and pull out 2 spells and 2 lands. You can play Once Upon a Time as sort of a pseudo land grant or Ancient Stirring style effect for free if it's the first spell you've cast this game. So if you ever open with Once Upon a Time in your opener, you can treat it as either a land or a spell depending on how you draw. And it looks like just an excellent way of doing things. So imagine, you keep a 2-land hand with Pelt Collectors and a couple of with like a Pelt Collector, a Charming Prince, and like Knight of Autumn, God Eternal Ronos, something like that. And so you play your first land, you play Once Upon a Time to get your third land, and then you can play the Pelt Collector all on turn 1. It's just a really, really solid all-around card. Okay. So this is sort of there's a couple of different directions this style of deck could go. One is closer to a life gain package. There's another option to run a more token-centric approach. I did look at that list. The problem I had with running a token-centric approach was I wanted to see if I could use Lovestruck Beast, but because Lovestruck Beast doesn't work if your creatures are larger, it runs into something of a non-bow problem with Trostani Discordant. That might not be that big of an issue, and so it is worth testing. That list would be running probably Raise the Alarm at the 2-drop slot. It would be running March of the Multitudes, and then various other ways of making and pumping tokens. But if you're running a Johnny and Trostani, I feel like maybe you might run into the fact that your 3-mana 5/5 just winds up hanging out on defense and doesn't do a heck of a lot. I also wanted to try Outflank. I'm not sure how this card is going to work out, but I think in a deck like this, it might be able to function as sort of a pseudo-condemn style effect, and Condemn is one of the stronger 1-mana removal spells that gets printed since Path and Swords at least. So I do think it's worth giving this card a shot, in particular if you're in a more token-focused strategy. All right, now for our last deck for the day. This is an Azorius Charming Prince brew looking to rely on the flicker effect and again combine that with Teferi to give us 8 separate bounce effects as ways of generating a lot of incidental value, hopefully, and also trying to take advantage of a little bit more of a tricky build. So here I'm trying to take advantage of some of our other adventure effects. Brazen Borrower, for example, has the 2-mana side of Into the Royal or Blink of an Eye as an adventure called Petty Theft, and then you can cast it as a 3/1 flash and flyer that can only block creatures with flying. So this is sort of a slightly more flexible but slower, a little bit weaker Vendilion Click type card. You have a 3/1 fairy that can bounce. In particular, in this format, it lets you bounce opposing to fairies, which I think is going to be relevant. This card's not going anywhere, folks. I hate to break it to you, but Teferi Time Reveler is just absolutely insane. And there's just no way this card doesn't see play in this format. As other ways of relying on the bounce effect, all told, we actually have 14 bounce effects in this deck. There's the 4 Charming Prince, the I guess bounce/flicker effects. There's 4 Charming Prince, 4 Brazen Borrowers, 4 Teferis, and then I have 2 copies of Run Away Together as an interesting combat trick to experiment with. Azorius has some excellent targets right now. Brazen Borrower fills in the curve nicely. You have Fibblethip at 2 as a nice way of just drawing cards and gumming up the ground a bit. Hypnotic Sprite does double duty as a flyer and also a counterspell for cheap cards. Deputy of Detention is a nice catch-all. Works with your sort of, works as a Conclave Tribunal, Prison Realm style card. Dungeon Geists looks absolutely fantastic in this deck. We have a lot of ways to reset it to deal with larger, more problematic cards as they play them, bigger threats. And then a little bit more incidental value off of Elite Guard Mage and Cavalier of Gales. It may turn out being that this 2-2 split, this is sort of something I like to do early on in a format. If I'm not sure what card is going to be better in which slot, I like to leave myself some more options. I suspect Dungeon Geists is going to be stronger in this strategy, and that we might want to be a little bit heavier on the aggressive flyers like Hypnotic Sprite. But for now, I'm running a 2-2 split as a way of hedging a little bit against aggro and also giving myself a little more data on which card I'd rather draw in which matchup, how common those matchups are, etc. I also have 2 Cavalier of Gales for the late game. This gives us a nice 5/5 flyer that generates a good amount of card advantage. And then a Counterspell Suite and Dig Suite to back up the Hypnotic Sprites in Absorb, Dovin's Veto, and Opt. On top of that, we have 2 copies of Mystic Sanctuary as ways of getting back our counterspells in the late game. We might need a couple more instants and sorceries to justify 2 copies here. Maybe an additional Veto or Absorb, maybe another Runaway Together. Maybe something like a Tail's End main would be reasonable. Something in that space. But for now, I'm going to try the 10. Worst case, you get back an Opt and get yourself an extra Scry. Also running 2 copies of Castle Vantress for some late game Scry effects. Again, this is sort of the 2-2 split to see which one I like in which situations. Gives a nice way of figuring that out, hopefully relatively quickly, and then you can adjust the deck accordingly. For the sideboard, again, this is sort of a generalized sideboard. Mesmerizing Benthid to deal with some of the larger ground decks, give us a little bit more game along with the Dungeon Geists. Creates a bunch of ways of gumming up the ground with the flicker effects, giving you the ability to make more blue illusion tokens and just sort of get in your opponent's way. This is a good way of chumping Cavaliers and threatening to eat smaller creatures. 2 copies of Cavalier of Dawn as ways of dealing with problematic enchantments, planeswalkers, things of that nature once they stick. It is possible we want one of these main, but given how white intensive it is and the fact that this is a base blue deck, I was trying to skew more heavily blue. Mystical Dispute for tempo and control mirrors against other blue decks. This is the sort of Mana Leak Pyroblast hybrid card. Dovin's Veto, Devout Decree, Aether Gust, sort of the usual suspects here. A copy of Tail's End as a catch-all for Planeswalkers and other legendary permanents that might show up. With Dominaria rotating, this might not be necessary, but I have it here for now just in case. Guard Mage against aggro. Might need a little bit more against aggro here, depending on exactly what shows up. All right, there you have it. 4 different Charming Prince brews. Welcome to the channel for those who are watching. If you really like this content and want to see some more similar content, I have a couple of additional videos coming up. One that's going to take a look at Bone Crusher Giant. I think I have a decent build of Arclight Phoenix. I also think there's a couple of good Gruul builds to look at and possibly a Boros build that I want to take a look at. Please throw out a like, throw out a subscribe or a follow if this is something you'd like to see more of. And you can catch me on Twitch at twitch.tv/MrVimesMTG. Thanks a bunch, everybody, and have a nice day.